Do. Test. Alright, that's working. Test. Alright, it's working. Alright, today, going back, doing more American history research. Gonna start off with some boring stuff and then go into some fun Revolutionary War stuff. Gonna see what new interesting things we can learn about the founding of America. All right. Federalist number 10, James Madison. All right. Among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. All right. He will not fail, therefore, to set a due value on any plan which, without violating the principles to which he is attached, provides a proper cure for it. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have, in truth, been the moral disease under which popular governments has everywhere perished. So he's talking shit about the Articles of Confederation, of how they have not been working. They're diseased, as he puts it, as they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics from which the adversaries to the liberty derive their most specious declamations. The value improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much admired, but it would be unwarranted, particularly to contend that they have as effectively obviated the danger on this side as was which and it's expected. He's like, well, we've made some good gains, but it has not been enough. These articles have sucked ass. Complaints are everywhere, heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of the public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and rights of the minor party, but to the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. So he's pointing out that while we were really hoping that these like loose confederations would like help with all these problems we're having, all the problems we thought that might happen are happening, and not the goods that were happening. All right. However, anxious we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of the known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true. It will be found, indeed, on a candid review of our situation, that some of the distress under which we labor have been erroneously charged on the operation of our governments. But it will be found at the same time that other causes will not alone account for many of our heaviest misfortunes, and particularly for the prevailing and increasing distrust of public engagements, and alarm for private rights, which echoed from one end of the continent to the other. These must be chiefly, if not wholly, effects of the unsteadiness and injustice to which the fractious spirit has tainted our public administration. So he's going on, still talking shit about the Articles of Confederation, that they're just really exacerbating divisions that have already existed. But let's take a little break. Let's do a little fun stuff. Oh, I'm getting a message. Oh,
so the Elon Musk.
All right. Jesus Christ. Am I getting so messy? All right. Well, going to political reactions. After the Patriot victory at Concord, moderates in Congress, led by John Dickinson, drafted the Olive Branch Petition, offered to accept royal authority in return for George III mediating in dispute. However, after this petition was immediately followed by the Declaration of Causes of Necessity and Taking up Arms. So this was one. These letters were supposed to arrive much separated apart, but they arrived basically at the same time. Colonial Secretary Lord Dartmouth viewed the offer as insincere and refused to present the petition to the king. So the king never even saw it, which is fucking wild. So he never even saw like the Olive Branch petition. Although constitutionally correct, since George could not oppose his own government, it disappointed those Americans who hoped would mediate the dispute. While the hostility of his language annoys even loyalist members of Congress, combined with the proclamation of rebellion in August 23rd in response to the Battle of Bunker Hill. We haven't even got to the Battle of Bunker Hill. Why are you getting over here? Backed by the Whigs, Parliament initially rejected the imposition of coercive measures by 170 votes, fearing an aggressive policy would drive Americans towards independence. However, by the end of 74, the collapse of the British authority meant both, because they had a collapse of government in the middle of all these negotiations going on, and they had to form a new government, which was probably not good timing for the British wanting peace. After Boston, Gage halted operations and awaited reinforcements. The Irish Parliament approved the recruitment of new regiments while allowing Catholics to enlist for the first time. Britain also signed a series of new treaties with German states to supply the additional troops, the famous Hessians that we'll be seeing much later. Within a year, it had an army of over 32,000 men in America. What was the population of America in 1776? 2.5 million people. That's a pretty large army for the colonies, but not really big enough for the size of it, but for 2.5 million people. The largest ever sent outside of Europe at the time. It was very big. The employment of German soldiers against people viewed as British citizens was opposed by many in Parliament and by the colonial assemblies. Combined with the lack of activity by Gage, opposition to this use of foreign troops allowed patriots to take control of the legislators. All right. The Declaration of Independence. We already read all this, so let's go through it real quick. We actually read the entire Declaration of Independence. It was interesting. It was fun. So maybe let's go through it real quick. Support for independence was boosted by Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which I also wrote on stream last week, which was published on Jan 10th, 76, and argued for American self-government, which was widely reprinted. The draft of the Declaration of Independence, the Second Continental Congress appointed the Committee of Five: Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The Declaration was written almost exclusively by Jefferson. I think Adams had a lot of sway in it as well, though. Identifying inhabitants of the 13 colonies as one people, the Declaration simultaneously dissolved political links with Britain, which included a long list of alleged violations of English rights committed by George III. This is also one of the first times that the colonies referred to as the United States, rather than the more common United Colonies. I didn't even know that. That was the... On July 2nd, Congress voted for the independence and published the Declaration on July 4th. At this point, the revolution ceased to be an internal dispute over trade and tax policy and evolved into civil war. Since each state represented in Congress was engaged in a struggle with Britain, but also split the American patriots and American loyalists. Patriots generally supported independence from Britain and a new national union in Congress, while loyalists remained faithful to British rule. Estimates vary. One suggests being the population whole was split evenly between patriots, committed loyalists, and those who were indifferent. Other calculate a split of 40 patriot, 40 neutral, 20 loyalist, but with considerable regional variations. Yeah, loyalists were a lot more common in the southern colonies than the northern colonies. So the northern colonies were probably way more patriotic than the southern colonies were. I'm not sure why that is the case. I think maybe it was the northern colonies were probably more in like international trade and were hurt a lot more by these taxes. The southern colonies were probably a little more insular, and they were selling, they were more agricultural colonies, so they probably didn't see all the pains of the like taxes and things that the northern colonies would have. On the onset of war, the Second Continental Congress realized defeating Britain would require foreign alliances and intelligence gathering. The Committee of Secret Correspondence was formed for the sole purpose of corresponding with our friends in Great Britain and other parts of the world, from 1775 to 1776. The committee shared information and built alliances through secret correspondence, as well as employing secret agents in Europe to gather intelligence, conduct undercover operations, analyze foreign publications, the initial patriot propaganda campaigns. Paine served as a secretary, while Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane, sent to France to recruit military engineers, were instrumental in securing the French aid in Paris. War breaks out. All right. The Revolutionary War included two campaigns, the Northern Theater and the Southern Theater, and a smaller but strategically important third one west of the Appalachian Mountains. I wonder why that one, I consider that one important. All right. I already pre-watched, and I got the Battle of Lexington and Concord already. I got a little map. I'm going to try to map this as I go. I want to like try to get my, I think that'll help me like learn this and stick this in my brain better if I do it myself. So the British, they came out of Boston, and they came from the east towards Lexington and Concord. All right, battles of Lexington and Concord, the famous, the shot heard around the world, was the first major military campaign of the American Revolution, resulting in American victory and outpouring of militia support for the anti-British cause. This is just the overview. We can skip past this. All right. Background. All right. The British Army's infantry, nicknamed Redcoats and sometimes Devils, and Lobsters was another one that I know about. They had occupied Boston since 1768 and began augmenting by naval forces and marines to enforce the colonies since the Intolerable Acts, which had been passed by British Parliament to punish the province of Massachusetts Bay for the Boston Tea Party and other acts of protest. General Gage was the military governor of Massachusetts and the commander-in-chief of roughly 3,000 military forces stationed in Boston. All right, so there was 3,000 British Boston people. Actually, no, wait, I already got a delete. Still. All right, so the British had 3,000 troops in Boston. He had no control over the Massachusetts outside of Boston. However, when the implementation of the acts had increased tensions between the Patriot Whig majority and the pro-British Tory minority, Gage's plan was to avoid conflict by removing military supplies from Whig militias using small secret rapid strikes. The struggle for supplies led one British success and several Patriot successes in a series of nearly bloodless conflicts known as the Powder Alarms. Gage considered himself to be a friend of liberty and attempted to separate his duties as governor and as a general of the occupying force. Man, I don't see how that could work. The colonists had been forming militias since the very beginning of the colonial settlement for the purpose of defense against Indian attacks. These forces also saw action in the French and Indian Wars, and when they fought against British regulars. Under the laws of each New England colony, all towns are obligated to form militia companies composed of all males 16 years of age and older. There were exceptions for some categories, and to ensure that the members were properly armed, the Massachusetts militias were formally under the jurisdiction of the provisional government. But militia companies throughout New England elected their own officers. So all these militias had their own little people in charge, even though they were auspiciously under the governor of the colony. Gage effectively dissolved the provisional government under the terms of the Massachusetts Government Act, and existing connections were employed by the colonists under the Massachusetts Provisional Government. And these are all these shadow, what they called the shadow government of when all the patriots started forming their own little congresses through all the states. All right, British government preparations. Man. So the last buy we read, the British had 3,000 guys in Boston. Let's see if it changes here. Both houses declared that it is in a state of rebellion exist, and then it's just a passage from him saying that the colonists are in a state of rebellion. April 14th, 1775, Gage received his instructions from the Secretary of State, William Ledge, to disarm the rebels and imprison the rebellion leaders. But Dartmouth gave Gage considerable discretion in his commands. Gage's decisions to act promptly may have influenced the information he received on April 15th from a spy within the Provisional Congress, telling him that although Congress was still divided on the need for armed resistance, delegates were being sent out to other New England colonies to see if they would cooperate in raising a New England army of 18,000 colonial soldiers. So the colonies had a plan of raising 18,000 soldiers, or at least the northern colonies did. On the morning 18th, Gage ordered a mounted patrol of about 20 men under the command of Major Mitchell of the 5th Regiment of Foot into the surrounding country to intercept message of who might be on horseback. This patrol behaved differently from patrols sent out from Boston in the past, staying out after dark and asking travelers about the location of Samuel Adams and John Hancock. So they were looking for the two instigators. This had the unintended effect of alarming many residents and increasing their preparedness. The Lexington militia in particular began to muster in the early evening. So we got Lexington starts mustering. So they got some dudes coming. I just lost my fucking spot. Hours before receiving any word from Boston, a well-known story alleges that after nightfall, one farmer, Josiah Nelson mistook the British control for the colonists and asked them, "Have you heard anything about when the regulars are coming out?" Upon which he was slashed on his scalp with a sword. However, the story in this incident was not published until a century later, which suggests it might be just a family myth. The British had all these like patrols going out from Boston. They're looking for Adams. People are they're getting worked up. They're getting pissed. They're like, what are these redcoats planning to do? Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith received orders from Gage on the afternoon of April 18th with instructions that he was not read. Hold on, I messed that up. Received orders from Gage on the afternoon of April 18th with instructions that he was not to read them until his troops are underway. He was to proceed from Boston with utmost expedition and secrecy to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all malicious stores, but you will take care that the soldiers do not plunder the inhabitants or hurt private property. Gage used his restriction and did not issue a written orders for the arrest of rebel leaders, as he feared doing so might spark an uprising. All right, so he's taking some of his men and he's sending them up to Lexington to Concord through Lexington. American preparations. March 30th, 1775, issued the following resolution. Whenever the army under the command of General Gage, or any part thereof, to the number of 500, shall march out of the town of Boston with artillery and baggage, if aught to be deemed as designed to carry into execution by force of the late Parliament, in attempting of which, blah, blah, blah. This is, okay. So the rebel leaders, with the exception of Paul Revere and Joseph Warren, had all left Boston on April 8th. They received word of Dartmouth's secret instructions to General Gage from sources in London, well before they reached Gage himself. So the rebel leaders knew even before the general of the opposing army did what his orders were going to be. So all that work that Ben Franklin and the other secret, I can't remember their name, is like the secret society they had, were doing work. Adams and Hancock had fled Boston to the home of one of Hancock's relative, Jonas Clark, where they thought they would be safe from immediate threat of arrest. The Massachusetts militias had indeed been gathering a stock of weapons, powder, and supplies at Concord, and much further to the west in Worcester. Okay, so Concord, I don't know where Worcester is. Said to the west, somewhere that direction. All right. That doesn't matter for today. An expedition from Boston to Concord was widely anticipated after a large contingent of irregulars alarmed by the countryside by an expedition from Boston to Watertown. The Pennsylvania Journal, a newspaper in Philadelphia, this is the one that Thomas Paine worked for a lot of the time, reported it was supposed that they were going to Concord, where the Provisional Congress was now sitting. A quantity of provisions and warlike stores are lodged there. It is said to be intending to go out again soon. April 18th, Paul Revere began the midnight ride to Concord to warn the inhabitants that the British appeared to be planning an expedition. The ride was finished by Samuel Prescott. Upon hearing Prescott's news, the townspeople decided to remove the stores and distribute them among other towns nearby. All right, so they're arming up. The colonists were also aware that April 19th would be the date of the expedition. They knew this even before Gage knew this. Despite Gage's effort to keep the details hidden from all British rank and file, and even from the officers who would command the mission, there is a reasonable speculation that the confidential source of this intelligence was Margaret Gage. So his own wife was selling his ass out, who had sympathies with the colonial cause and had a friendly relationship with Warren. Damn, how bad that feel. It's like your own wife is selling out your military plans. Between 9 and 10 p.m. on the night of April 18th, Joseph Warren told Revere and Dawes that British troops were about to embark in boats from Boston bound for Cambridge and the road to Lexington and Concord. Warren's intelligence suggested that the most likely objective of the regulars' movements later that night would be to capture Adams and Hancock. They did not worry about the possibility of regulars marching to Concord, since the supplies at Concord were safe, but they did think their leaders in Lexington were unaware of the potential danger that night. Revere and Dawes were sent out to warn them and to alert the colonial militias in nearby towns. So the British has sent out an expedition thinking that they're going to get some stores, but the stores are already split up and gone. But everyone's worried that they might get boss mans. Militia forces assemble. Dawes covered the southern land route by horseback across the Boston Neck and over the Great Bridge to Lexington. Revere first gave instructions to send a signal to Charlestown using lanterns hung in the steeps of the Old North Church. He then traveled the northern water route, crossing the mouth of the Charles River by rowboat, slipping past the British warship, the Somerset. Crossings were banned at this hour, but Revere safely landed in Charlestown and rode west to Lexington, warning almost every house along the route. Additional riders were sent north from Charlestown. All right. After they arrived in Lexington, Revere, Dawes, Hancock, and Adams discussed the situation with the militia assembling there. So in Lexington, they're assembling. But I don't have any numbers on this number yet, though. The Lexington men dispatched riders to the surrounding towns. Revere and Dawes continued along the road to Concord, accompanied by Samuel Prescott. In Lincoln, they ran into a British control. Revere was captured, Dawes was thrown from his horse, and only Prescott escaped to Concord. Additional riders were sent out from Concord. So they were just sending riders out, trying to gather all the militia to come and meet up at Lexington. The ride of Revere, Dawes, and Prescott triggered a flexible system of alarm and muster, which had been carefully developed months before, in reaction to the colonists' important response to the powder alarm. The powder alarm was the British kept going out and trying to find stores where the militias were keeping their weapons and powder and destroying them. The system was an improved version of an old notification network used in time of emergency. The colonists had periodically used it in the early years of the Indian Wars in the colony before it fell into disuse in the French and Indian War. In addition to other express riders delivering messages, bells, drums, alarm guns, bonfires, trumpets were used for rapid communication from town to town, notifying the rebels in dozens of eastern Massachusetts villages that they would muster their militias because over 500 regulars were leaving Boston. All right, so I finally have a fucking number. All right, so he's 500. So the 3,000 that he has in Boston, he has now split off 500, and he's sending them up towards Lexington. This system was so efficient that people in towns 25 miles away were aware of the Army's movements while they were still unloading boats in Cambridge. Okay, so they're not that far yet. They're still there. These early warnings played a crucial role in the assembling a sufficient number of colonial militia to inflict heavy damage on the British regulars later that day. Adams and Hancock were eventually moved to safety, first to what is now Burlington and later Brecla. Oh, here's a nice map. So that's where Revere went. And then he got trapped by the patrol there. All right. The British forces advance. Around dusk, General LeGage called a meeting of his senior officers at the province house. He informed them that the instructions from Lord Dartmouth had arrived, ordering him to take action against the colonials. He also told him that their senior colonel of his regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Smith, would command. All right, so this is Smith's. I'm gonna label these. We're gonna learn Major John Pickran as his executive officer. The meeting adjourned around 8:30 p.m., after which Earl Percy mingled with townsfolk at the Boston Commons. According to one account, the discussion among the people there turned to the unusual movement of British soldiers in town. When Percy questioned one man further, he replied, "Well, the regulars will miss their aim." Ooh, he's talking shit. "What aim?" asked Percy. "Why, the cannon at Concord," was the reply. Upon hearing this, Percy quickly returned to the Province House and relayed this information to General Gage. Stunned, Gage issued orders to prevent messengers from getting out of Boston, but it was too late, as Dawes and Revere had already left at like 5 o'clock in the fucking morning. British regulars, 700 infantry. They told me it's 500 just a second ago. You lied for me. Commanded 10 elite infantry companies. How much is a infantry company? Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin commanded 11 grenadier companies under the overall command of Elizabeth Smith. Okay, so this wasn't 500, it was 700. Why can't I edit you? Of the troops assigned to the expedition, 350 were from the grenadier companies, a bunch of grenadier companies, and the 1st Battalion of his Marine forces. Protecting the grenadiers, about 320 light infantry from all these light infantry regiments, and the 1st Battalion of Marines. Each company had its own lieutenant, but the majority of the captains commanding them were volunteers attached to them at the last minute, drawn from all the regiments stationed in Boston. This lack of familiarity between the command and company would cause problems during the battle. Ooh, foreshadowing. The British began awakening their troops at 9 p.m. on the night of April 18th and assembled them on the water's edge of the western Boston Common. Colonel Smith was late in arriving, and there was no organized boat loading operation, resulting in confusion at the staging area. The boats used were naval barges and were packed so tightly that there was no room to sit down. When they disembarked, it was into waist-deep water at midnight. After a lengthy halt to unload their gear, the regulars began the 17-mile march to Concord at 2 a.m. You get woken up in the middle of the night to just like, your officer's not even there, so you're just waiting, and then you get on these shitty-ass boats. During the wait, they provided with extra ammunition, cold salt pork, and sea biscuits. They did not carry knapsacks, since they would not be encamped. They carried their haversacks, canteens, muskets, accoutrements, and marched off into the wet, muddy shoes and soggy uniforms. As they marched through Mintomi, sounds of the colonial alarms throughout the countryside caused few of the officers who were aware of the mission to realize that they had lost the element of surprise. At 3 a.m., Colonel Smith sent Major Pickram ahead with 6 companies of light infantry in orders to quick march to Concord. Order of battle. All right. Go in the bathroom before I get started on this. All right. Oh, okay. That's a lot more. The colonial force included 4,000 militia. Okay. This probably wasn't all in one spot. All right, but they had 4,000 here. That's crazy. Units turned up piecemeal over the course of the day. 30 towns from the surrounding area sent men into combat, with many more on the way. By afternoon, many regimental commands were fundamentally present and acting in coordinated manner. Several provincial generals were also en route to the fighting during the day, but not in a position to assert overall command. General William Heath Roxbury of Massachusetts exerted command of phase toward the end of the day. Battles. All right. So they're assimilating. They got 4,000 dudes here. And the British have about 800. All right, although often styled a battle, in reality the engagement at Lexington was a minor brush or skirmish, as the regular advanced guard under Pitcairn entered Lexington at sunrise. So we're at sunrise, the forward element. We'll give them a little tiny dot. All right, so they're meeting at Lexington. About 80 Lexington militia emerged from Buckman Tavern and stood in ranks at the Lexington Common, watching them. And between 40 and 100 spectators watched from along the side of the road. Their leader, John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian Wars, had developed tuberculosis, and it was at times difficult to hear. Of the militiamen who lined up, 9 had the surname Harrington, 7 Monroe, including the company's old orderly sergeant William Monroe, 4 Parker, 3 Tidd, 3 Locke, and 3 Reed. Fully 1/4 of them related to Captain Parker in some way. The group, it was just like this family of fucking Massachusetts dudes. This group of militiamen was part of Lexington's training band, a way of organizing local militia dating back to the Puritans, and not what was styled as a Minutemen company. After having waited most of the night with no sign of any British troops and wondering if Paul Revere's warning was true, at about 4:15 a.m., Parker got his confirmation. Thaddeus Bowman, the last scout Parker had sent out, rode up at a gallop and told him that they were not only coming, but coming in force, and they were close. Captain Parker was clearly aware that he was outmatched in the confrontation and was not prepared to sacrifice his men for no purpose. He knew that most of the colony's powder and military supplies at Concord had already been hidden. No war had been declared. The Declaration of Independence was more than 14 months in the future. He had also known that the British had gone on such expeditions before, found nothing, and marched back to Boston. Parker had every reason to expect this to occur again. The regulars would march to Concord, find nothing, return to Boston, tired but empty-handed. He positioned his company carefully, and he placed them in the parade ground formation on the Lexington Common. They were in plain sight, not hiding behind walls, but not blocking the road to Concord. They made a show of political and military determination, but no effort to prevent the marching of the regulars. Many years later, one of the participants recalled Parker's words as being now engraved in stone at the site of the battle. "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have war, let it begin here." According to Parker's sworn disposition taken after that battle, I ordered our militia to meet on the commons to consult what to do, and concluded not to be discovered, or nor meddle or make with said regular troops if they should approach, unless they should insult or molest us, and upon their sudden approach I immediately ordered our militia to disperse and not to fire. Immediately said troops made their appearance and rushed fervently, fired upon, killing 8 of our party without receiving any provocation there from us. Rather than turn left towards Concord, Marine Lieutenant Jesse Adair, at the head of the advance guard, decided on his own to protect the flank of the British column by turning right and then leading his companions into the common itself. In a confused effort to surround and disarm the militia, Major Pitcairn arrived to the rear of the advance force and led his 3 companies to the left and halted them. The remaining companies under Colonel Smith lay further down the road towards Boston. Whew. A British officer, probably Pitcairn, but accounts are uncertain, as it may have been Sutherland, rode forward waving a sword and called out to the assembled militia to disperse, and may have also ordered them to lay down your arms, you damned rebels. Captain Parker, what do you got? What do you got? Oh, you can have that. It's your bone. You can have that. The yelling around, and due to the raspiness of Parker's tuberculous voice, some did not hear him, some left very slowly, and none laid down their arms. Both Parker and Pitcairn ordered their men to hold fire, but a shot was fired from an unknown source. At 5 o'clock, we arrived in Lexington, saw a number of people, I believe between 200 and 300, formed in a common in the middle of town. We still continued advancing, keeping prepared against an attack, although without intending to attack them. But on our coming near, they fired on us 2 shots, upon which our men, without any orders, rushed upon them, fired, and put them into flight. Several of them were killed. We could not tell how many, because they were behind walls and in the woods. This was a lie. This was to cover his own ass, because they were in the commons, which is a giant open space for the purpose of being a commons. It was like the Battle of the Common, or the event at the Common, whatever you want to call it, whatever it was. We had a man in the 10th Light Infantry wounded. Nobody else was hurt. We then formed on the Common, but there was some difficulty. The men were so wild they could hear no orders. We waited a considerable time there, and at length proceeded our way to Concord. All right, so they had their little skirmish at Lexington. This is a little boop. Just a little boop. Just the forward parties booping into each other. So, according to one member of the Parker's militia, none of the Americans had discharged their muskets as they faced the oncoming British troops. The British did suffer 1 casualty. Damn, dog, you scared the fuck out of me. I thought you just puked. According to one member of the Parker militia, none of the Americans had discarded their muskets on the oncoming British troops. The British did suffer 1 casualty, a slight wound, the particulars of which were corroborated by the disposition John Monroe. All right, some guy was wounded. We don't need to read the disposition. Some witnesses among the regulars reported the first shots was fired by a colonial onlooker from beyond a hedge or around a corner of a tavern. So it was probably neither the militia nor the regulars, according to this guy. Some observers reported a mounted British officer firing first. Both sides generally agreed that the initial shot did not come from the men on the ground immediately facing each other. Speculation arose later in Lexington that a man named Solomon Brown fired the first shot from inside the tavern or from behind a wall. But this has been discredited. Some witnesses on each side claim that someone from the other side fired first. However, many more witnesses claimed to not know. So it was probably pretty vague. It's kind of like the same thing that happened at the Boston Massacre. Nobody really sure what exactly happened. It was a big kerfuffle. Yet another theory is that the first shot was fired by the British, one which killed Asher Porter, their prisoner who was running away. He had been told to walk away and he would be let go, though he panicked and began to run. Historian David Hackett Fisher has proposed that there may have actually been multiple near simultaneous shots. So nobody really knows. I don't know if it really matters. Historian Mark Urban said that after telling them to disperse, Pitcairn signaled his soldiers to move forward and disarm the locals. The sight of the Americans lowering their weapons and moving off touched a nerve among British soldiers. For months, the local people had abused and taunted them instead of a deliberate, orderly walk forward. Many British soldiers started shouting and cheering, running towards the Americans with bayonets still fixed. Facing this onslaught, one or two of those villagers opened fire. Without orders from Pitcairn, one of the formed British companies leveled its weapons and let fly a crashing volley. Witnesses at the scene described several intermediate shots from both sides before the line of regulars began to fire volleys without receiving orders to do so. A few of the militiamen believed at first that the regulars were only firing powder with no balls, but then they realized the truth. Few, if any, of the militias managed to load and return fire. The rest ran for their lives. With Nathaniel Mulliken, Philip Russell, and 32 other men, do testify and declare that on the 19th in the morning, being informed that a body of regulars were marching from Boston toward Concord, about 5 o'clock in the morning, hearing our drumbeat, we proceeded towards the parade, and soon found a large body of troops were marching toward us. Some of our company were coming to the parade, and others had reached it, at which time the companies began to disperse while our backs were turned on the troops. We were fired on by them, and a number of our men instantly killed and wounded. Not a gun was fired by any person in our company on the regulars to our knowledge before they had fired on us, and continued firing until we had made our escape. The regulars then charged forward with bayonets. Captain Parker's cousin, Jonas, was run through. 8 Lexington men were killed and 10 were wounded. Only one British casualty was a soldier who was wounded in the thigh. The 8 colonists killed were these guys that fatally wounded by a British musket ball, managed to crawl back to his home and died in his own doorstep. One wounded man, Prince Esterbrook, was a black slave who was serving in the militia. The companies under Pitcairn's command had got beyond their officials' control, in part because they were unaware of the actual purpose of the day's mission. They fired in different directions and prepared to enter private homes. Colonel Smith, who had arrived with the remainder of the regulars, heard the musket fire, rode forward from the grenadier camp to see the action. He quickly found a drummer and ordered him to beat assembly. The grenadiers arrived shortly thereafter, and once order was restored among the soldiers, the light infantry was permitted to fire a victory volley, at which the column was reformed and marched toward Concord. Victory volley. What a fucking bunch of pompous douchebags. I fired a volley into a crowd of people and declared victory when no one fired back at them. All right, we're moving on to Concord. Is this where the actual battle? I can't. Yeah, this is where things actually start happening. Concord. In response to the raised alarm, the militiamen of Concord and Lincoln had mustered in Concord. All right, so the militia is here. The British had just done their kerfuffle of Lexington, as we'll call it. It wasn't really a battle. It was the kerfuffle of Lexington. They received reports of firing at Lexington and were not sure whether to wait until they could be reinforced by troops from towns nearby, or to stay and defend the town, or to move east and greet the British army from superior terrain. A column of militia marched down the road towards Lexington to meet the British, about 1.5 miles, until they met the approaching column of regulars. All right. I don't have like a measuring tool on here, so I'm not sure how far a mile and a half is. As the regulars numbered about 700, and the militia at the time only numbered about 250. All right, so they had 250. So they have 250, and then regulars have 700. The militia column turned and marched back to Concord. Okay, so they came out, marched up, saw them, and they're like, and marched back. Preceding the regulars at a distance of about 500 yards, the militia retreated to the ridge overlooking the town, which should be there. With Archer's Ridge, which I believe it is. And their officers discussed what to do next. Caution prevailed, and Colonel Barrett withdrew from the center of town and led his men across the North Bridge to a hill about a mile north. Okay, so there's somewhere a hill north of town. This step proved fortuitous as the ranks of militia continued to grow as the militia companies arrived from western towns joining them there. All right. So they move a mile north of town. People keep joining in. The British make it to Concord. When the British troops arrive at the village of Concord, Lieutenant Colonel Smith divided them to carry out Gage's orders. The 10th Regiment's company of grenadiers secured the South Bridge, while 7 companies of light infantry under Parsons, numbering about 100, secured the North Bridge, where there were visible across the cleared fields to the assembled militia companies. Captain Parkins took 4 companies up the road 2 miles beyond the North Bridge to search Barrett's farm, where intelligence indicated supplies to be found. 2 companies from the 4th and 10th were stationed to guard the return route, and 1 company from the 43rd remained to guard the bridge itself. These companies, which were under the relative inexperience, were aware that they're significantly outnumbered by the 400-plus militiamen. The Concord captain, Leroy, sent a message to Colonel Smith requesting reinforcements. Using detailed information provided by loyalist spies, the Grenadier companies searched the small town for military supplies. When they arrived at Ephraim Jones' Tavern by the jail at the Southbridge Roads, they found the door barred shut, and Jones refused them entry. According to reports provided by local loyalists, Pitcairn knew cannon had been buried on the property. Jones was ordered at gunpoint to show where the guns were buried. These turned out to be 3 massive pieces, firing 24-pound shot that were much too heavy to use defensively, but were very effective against fortifications. The Grenadiers smashed the truncheons of the 3 guns so they could not be mounted, but they also burned some of the gun carriages found in the village meeting house, where the fire spread to the meeting house itself. Local residents, Martha Multhune, persuaded the soldiers to help in a bucket brigade to save the building. Nearly 100 barrels of flour and salted foods were thrown into the mill pond. Why? As were 550 pounds of musket balls. Of the damage done, only that done to the cannon was significant. All the shot and much of the food was recovered after the British left. Yeah, how are you going to try to, we're going to throw these musket balls in the water? It's like, all right, well, let's go get them later. During the search, regulars were generally scrupulous in their treatment of the locals, including paying for food and drink consumed. The excessive politeness was used as advantage by the locals, who were able to misdirect searches from several smaller caches of militia supplies. Barrett's farm had been an arsenal weeks before, but few weapons remained now, and according to family legends, these were quickly buried in furrows to look like a crop had been planted. That's kind of clever. All right. Barrett's farm. The troops sent there did not find any supplies of consequence. Colonel Barrett's troops, upon seeing smoke rising from the village square as the British burned the cannon carriers, and seeing only a few light infantry companies directly below them, decided to march back to town from their vantage point to a lower, closer, flat hilltop from the North Bridge. As the militia advanced, the 2 British companies, the 4th and the 10th, held the position near the road, retreated to the bridge, and yielded the hill to Barrett's men. What did it... Delete that. Why? Just to fuck with me? Five full companies of Minutemen and 5 more militia from Acorn, Concord, Bedford, and Lincoln occupied this hill as more groups of men streamed in, totaling about 400 against Captain Laurie's light infantry companies, a force of about 90 to 95 men. All right, so the British were all split up, going all over the place at this point. They had about 100 dudes. There. Out of the 700 total, so there's 600 going in other places. And the militia had about 400 at this point. Still outnumbered, almost 2 to 1, but not that bad. Barrett ordered the Massachusetts men to form one long line, 2 abreast, on the highway leading down to the bridge. Then he called for another consultation. While overlooking the North Bridge from the hill, Lieutenant Colonel John Robinson of Westford and the other captains discussed a possible advance on the bridge. Barrett asked Captain Davis, who commanded a company of Minutemen from Acton, of his company would be willing to lead the advance. Davis responded, "I'm not afraid to go, but I haven't a man that's afraid. I'm not afraid to go, and I haven't a man that's afraid to go." Barrett told the men to load their weapons, but not to fire unless fired upon, then ordered them to advance. Laurie ordered the British companies guarding the bridge to retreat across it. One officer then tried to pull up the loose planks of the bridge to impede the Colonials' advance, but Major Burke began to yell at the regulars to stop harming the bridge. The Minutemen and militia from Concord, Acton, and Lincoln, and a handful of Westford Minutemen advanced in a column formation 2 by 2 by their captains on the light infantry, keeping to the road, since it was surrounded by spring floodwaters of the Concord River. Captain Laurie then made a poor tactical decision. Since his summons for help had not been produced any results, he ordered his men to form positions for street firing beyond the bridge, in a column running perpendicular to the river. So they were on like this side of the river, kind of like stretched out as the militia came down. Why does it delete it? Why does it delete it? It's so... Alright, I gotta find a new program to do this shit with. It's really starting to get on my nerves. This formation was appropriate for sending a large volume of fire into a narrow alley between the buildings of a city, but not for open path beyond the bridge. Confusion reigned as regulars retreating over the bridge tried to form up in the street firing position of the other troops. Lieutenant Sutherland, who was in the rear of the formation, saw Laurie's mistake and ordered the flankers to be sent out. But as he was from a company of different men from under his command, yeah, this was mentioned earlier, that a lot of the commanders, they just kind of like picked guys to go do this. They didn't really like send like organized companies. So they weren't used to working with each other. The remainder tried as best they could in the confusion to follow the orders of the superior officer. A shot rang out, likely a warning shot fired by a panic exhausted British soldier from the 43rd. According to Captain Laurie's report of his commander after the fight, 2 other regulars then fired immediately after that, shots splashing in the river. And then the narrow group up front, possibly thinking the order to fire had been given, fired a ragged volley before Laurie could stop them. Two of the Acton militiamen, Private Auber Hosmer and Captain Isaac Davis, who were at the head of the line marching in the bridge, were hit and killed instantly. Reverend Dr. Ripley recalled, the Americans commenced their march in double file. In a minute or two, the Americans being in quick motion, and within 10 or 15 rods of the bridge, a single gun was fired by a British soldier, which marked the way, passing under Colonel Robinson's arm and slightly wounding the side of Luther Blackguard, a Pfeiffer, in the Acton Company. 4 men were wounded. Major Buttrick then yelled for the militia to fire, for God's sake, fellow soldiers, fire. At this point, the lines were separated by the Concord River and the bridge. There were only about 50 yards between them. The few front rows of the colonists, bound by the road and blocked from forming a line to fire, managed to fire over each other's heads and shoulders at the regulars massed across the bridge. 4 of the 8 British officers and sergeants who were leading from the front of their troops were wounded by the volley of musket fire. At least 3 privates were killed and mortally wounded, and 9 more were wounded. 9 more privates were wounded. In 1824, Reverend of the Militiamen Joseph Thaxter wrote, I was eyewitness to the following facts. The people of Westford and Acton, some few of Concord, were the first who faced the British at Concord Bridge. The British had placed about 90 men at guard at the North Bridge. We had no certain information that any had been killed at Lexington. We saw the British making destruction in the town of Concord. It was proposed to advance to the bridge. On this, Colonel Robinson of Westford, together with Major Buttrick, took lead. Strict orders were given not to fire unless the British fired first. When they advanced about halfway on the causeway, the British fired 1 gun, a second, a third, and then a whole body. They killed Colonel Davis of Acton and Mr. Hosmer. Our people then fired over each other's heads. I wonder how you freaking do that with a musket. Our people then fired over one's head. Being in a long column, 2 by 2, they killed 2 and wounded 11. Lieutenant Hawkstone, said to be the greatest beauty of the British Army, had his cheek so badly wounded that it disfigured him much, of which he bitterly complained. On this, the British fled and assembled on the hill on the north side of Concord. All right, so they fell back. There's some hill on the north side of Concord. It's hard to tell because this is a modern day map that I'm using. So what is this hill? Or maybe they were coming from here. They're actually probably coming from Sudbury. And they didn't say what river it was. As they descended the hill near the road that comes out of Bedford, they were pursued. Colonel Bridge, with a few of his men from Bedford and Chelmsford, came up, killed several men. The regulars found themselves trapped in a situation where they were both outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Lacking effective leadership and terrified at the superior numbers of the enemy, their spirit broken and likely not having experienced combat before, they abandoned their wounded and fled to the safety of the approaching grenadier companies coming from the town center, isolating Captain Parsons and their companies searching for arms at Barrett Farms. All right. The colonists were stunned by their success. No one had actually believed either side would shoot to kill another. Some advanced, many more retreated. Some went home to see their safety of their homes and families. Colonel Barrett eventually began to recover control. He moved some of the militia back to the hilltop. And sent Major Buttrick and others across the bridge to a defensive position on a hill behind a stone wall. All right, so the British lost some dude. They lost a little handful of guys. And they went and then the Americans went back across the river. No, he was still on this side of the river. Dude, this is pissing me off. Lieutenant Colonel Smith heard the exchange of fire from his position in the town moments after he received the request for reinforcement from Laurie. He quickly assembled 2 companies of grenadiers and led them toward the North Bridge himself. As these troops marched, they had met the shattered remnants of the 3 light infantry companies running towards them. Smith was concerned about the 4 companies that had been at Barrett since their route to town was now unprotected. When he saw the Minutemen in the distance behind the wall, he halted 2 companies and moved forward only his officers to take a closer look. One of the men behind the wall observed, "If we had fired, I believe we could have killed almost every officer there was in front, but we had no orders to fire, and there wasn't a gun fired." During a tense standoff lasting about 10 minutes, a mentally ill local man named Elias Brown wandered through both sides selling hard cider. What a... Oh, everything about this is so odd. At this point, the detachment of regulars sent to Barrett's farm marched back from their fruitless search of the area. They passed through the now mostly deserted battlefield and saw dead and wounded comrades lying on the bridge. There was one who looked to them as if he had been scalped, which angered and shocked the British soldiers. They crossed the bridge and returned to town by 10:30 a.m. So all the British are now back in town. Under the watchful eyes of the colonialists, who continued to maintain a defensive position, the regulars continued to search for and destroy colonial military supplies, ate lunch, reassembled for marching, and left Concord after noon. This delay in departure gave colonial militiamen from the outlying towns additional time to reach the road back to Boston. Whew. The return march. So they had left Lexington and Concord. They destroyed a cannon and threw some musket balls in the water that the colonialists just got back later. And they lost, a dozen or so dudes. All right. So they're leaving Concord. They're going back the road towards Lexington. Lieutenant Colonel Smith, concerned about the safety of his men, sent flankers to follow the ridge and protect his forces from the roughly 1,000 colonials now in the field as the British marched east out of Concord. The ridge ended near Merriam's Corner, a crossroad about 2 kilometers outside of the village of Concord. So he doesn't get that far out of Concord. And that was there's about 1,000 militiamen that have all been showing up. Although some had left after the first skirmish. A tributary of Millsbrook to cross the narrow bridge. The British had to pull the flankers back into the main column and close ranks to a mere 3 soldiers abreast. Colonial militia companies arriving from the north and east converged at this point and had a clear numerical advantage over the regulars. The British were now witnessing once again what General Gage had hoped to avoid by dispatching the expedition in secrecy and in the dark at night. The ability of the colonial militia to rise and converge by the thousands when the British forces ventured out of Boston. As the last of the British column marched over the narrow bridge, the British rearguard wheeled and fired a volley at the colonial militiamen, who had been firing irregularly and ineffectively from a distance, but now had closed within musket range. The colonists returned fire, this time with deadly effect. 2 regulars were killed and perhaps 6 wounded. No colonial casualties. Smith sent out his flanking troops to again after crossing the small bridge. So they crossed this bridge. The colonials are just following, peppering them the whole time, giving them shit. On Brooks Hill, also known as Hardy Hill, about 1 mile past Merriam's Corner, nearly 500 militiamen had assembled south of the road, awaiting opportunity to fire upon the British column on the road below. Smith's leading force charged up the hill to drive them off, but the colonials did not withdraw, inflicting significant casualties on the attacker. Smith withdrew his men from Brooks Hill, and the column continued on another small bridge into Lincoln. Where is Lincoln? So he's going this way. And they're just being fucked with the whole time. The regulars soon reached a point in the road referred to as the Bloody Angle, referred to as where the section of rises and curves sharply to the left through a lightly wooded area. At this place, the militia company from Woburn had positioned themselves on the southeast sides of the bend in the road in a rocky, lightly wooded field. Additional militia flowing parallel to the road from the engagement at Miriam's Corner positioned himself on the north side of the road, catching British in a crossfire, while the other militia companies on the road closed from behind to attack. Some 500 yards further along, the road took another sharp curve, this time to the right, and again the British column was caught by another large force of militiamen, firing from both sides. In passing through these two sharp curves, the British force lost 30 soldiers killed or wounded, and 4 colonial militiamen were also killed. So as they're like coming out of Lincoln, they're like having to go left or right on these like really like wooded paths, and the militia just keep setting up these little mini ambushes. The road took another sharp curve, this time to the right, blah, blah, blah. All right. In passing through these two sharp curves, lost 30 soldiers killed or wounded, including Captain Wilson of Bedford, Captain Nathaniel Wim of Belectria, and John Wilson of Natick, and Daniel Thompson of Woburn. The British soldiers escaped by breaking into a trot, a pace that the colonials could not maintain through the woods and swampy terrain. Since they were on the road, they were ambushing them. So the British just started like trotting. So they were able to get out of the ambushes that the colonials were setting up in the woods. Colonial forces on the road itself, behind the British, were too densely packed and disorganized to mount more than a harassing attack from the rear. As militia forces from other towns continued to arrive, the colonial force had risen to about 2,000. So now they outnumber by a lot. We started off with just like 400 or 200 and then 400 and 1,000. The road now straightened to the east with clear fields and orchards along the sides. Lieutenant Colonel Smith sent out flankers again, who succeeded in trapping some militia from behind, inflicting casualties. British casualties were also mounting from these engagements from persistent long-range fire from militiamen. The exhausted British were running low on ammunition. When the British column neared the boundary between Lincoln and Lexington, so probably like around here, encountered another ambush from a hill overlooking the road, set by Captain John Parker's Lexington militia. Included some of them bandaged up from the encounter in Lexington earlier the day. So the guys that started it all, they're back. At this point, Colonel Smith was wounded in the thigh and knocked from his horse. Major John Pitcairn assumed effective command of the column and sent the light infantry companies up the hill to kill the militia forces. The light infantry cleared 2 additional hills as the column continued east, the Bluff and Fisky Hill, and took some more casualties from ambushes set by fresh militia companies joining the battle. In one of the musket volleys from the colonial soldiers, Major Pitcairn's Holtz bolted in fright, throwing Pitcairn to the ground and injuring his arm. Now both principal leaders of the expedition were injured and unhorsed. Their men were tired, thirsty, and exhausting their ammunition. A few surrendered or were captured. Some now broke from mission and ran towards Lexington. They're so far from Boston. In the words of one British officer, we began to run rather than retreat in order. We attempted to stop men and form them into 2 deep, but to no purpose. The confusion increased rather than lessened. The officers got to the front and presented their bayonets and told men if they advanced, they should die. Upon this, they began to form up under heavy fire. They're not even to fucking Lexington yet. Only one British officer remained uninjured among the 3 companies at the head of the British column as it approached Lexington Center. He understood the column's perilous situation. There were only a few men that had any ammunition left, and so fatigued that we could not keep flanking parties out. So we soon must have laid down our arms or been picked off by rebels at their pleasure. And near to, we were not able to keep them off. He had heard cheering further ahead. A full brigade, about 1,000 men with artillery under the command of Earl Percy, has arrived to rescue them. All right, so another British force in Lexington has arrived to save their butts of 1,000 men, which is a third of what they had in Boston. We pursued them. We killed some. When they got to Lexington, they were so close pursued and fatigued, they must have soon surrendered. Had not learned Percy met them with a large reinforcement and 2 field pieces. They fired them, but the balls went high over our heads. But no cannon ever did more execution. Such stories of their effects had been spread by the Tories through our troops, that from the time more won't back then pursued. We pursued to Charlestown Commons and then retired to Cambridge. When the army collected at Cambridge, Colonel Prescott and his regiment of men and John Robinson, his lieutenant colonel, were prompt at being at their post. In their accounts afterwards, British officers and soldiers alike noted their frustration that the colonial militiamen fired from them from behind trees and stone walls, rather than confronting them in large linear formations in the style of European warfare. This image of the individual colonial farmer, musket in hand and fighting under his own command, has been fostered in American myth, chasing the redcoats down in the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again, under the trees and at the turns of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. To the contrary, beginning at Northbridge and throughout the British retreat, the colonial militia repeatedly operated in coordinated companies, even when dispersed to take advantage of cover. Reflecting on the British experience that day, Earl Percy understood the significance of the American tactics. During the whole affair, the rebels attacked us in a very scattered, irregular manner, but with perseverance and resolution. Nor did they ever dare to form any regular body. Indeed, they knew too well what was proper to do so. Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about, having been employed as rangers against the Indians and Canadians. And this country, being much covered with wood and hilly, is advantageous to their method of fighting. All right. So his expedition of 700 men, I never found their full tally, but meets up with Percy's 1,000 men. So let's say they lost 200. That's half of what's in Boston is now in Lexington. Like 1,500 men. General Gage had anticipated that Colonel Smith's expedition might require reinforcement, so Gage drafted orders for reinforcements to assemble in Boston at 5 a.m. But in his obsession for secrecy, Gage sent only one copy of the orders to the adjutant of the 1st Brigade, whose servant then left the envelope on the table. Also about 4 a.m., the British column was within 3 miles of Lexington. Lieutenant Colonel Smith now had a clear indication that the element of surprise had been lost and the alarm was spreading throughout the countryside, so he sent his rider back to Boston with a request for reinforcements. At about 5 a.m., the rider reached Boston, and the 1st Brigade was ordered to assemble. The line infantry companies and a battalion of Royal Marines under Earl Percy. Unfortunately for the British, once again, only one copy of the order was sent to each commander, and the order of the Royal Marines was delivered to the desk of Major Pitcairn, who was already on the fucking expedition. After 3 delays, Percy's brigade, about 1,000 strong, left Boston at 8:45 a.m., headed towards Lexington. Along the way, the story told, they marched to the tune of Yankee Doodle to taunt the inhabitants in the area. By the Bunker Hill, less than 2 months later, the song would become a popular anthem for the colonial forces. Percy took the land route across the Boston Neck. With some quick thinking, colonials had stripped it of its planking to deny this to the British. His men then came upon the absent-minded tutor at Harvard College and asked him which road would take them to Lexington. The harvestman, apparently oblivious to the reality of what was happening around him, showed him the proper road without thinking. He was later compelled to leave the country for inadvertently supporting the enemy. What a tool. Percy's troops arrived in Lexington about 2 p.m. They would hear gunfire in the distance and set up their cannon and deploy lines of regulars to the high ground commanding the views of the town. Colonel Smith's men approached like a fleeing mob with a full complement of colonial militia in close formation pursuing them. Percy ordered his artillery to open fire at extreme rage, dispersing the colonial militiamen. Smith's men collapsed with exhaustion once they reached safety of Percy's lines. Against the advice of his master of ordnance, Percy had left Boston without spear ammunition for his men or the 2 artillery pieces they had brought with them, thinking the extra wagons would slow him down. Each man in Percy's brigade only had 36 rounds, and each artillery was supplied with only a few rounds carried in side boxes. After Percy had left the city, Gage directed 2 ammunition wagons guarded by 1 officer and 13 men to follow. This convoy was interrupted by a small party of older veteran militiamen still on the alarms list who could not join the militia companies because they were well over 60 years of age. These men rose up in ambush and demanded the surrender of the wagons, but the regulars ignored them and drove their horses on. The old men opened fire, shot the lead horses, killed 2 sergeants, and wounded the officer. The British survivors ran. The 6 of them threw their weapons in the pond before they surrendered. The old dudes, man. The fucking boomers come out. Lexington to Minatomi. Percy assumed control of the combined force of about 1,700 men. All right, so we can delete one of these. Let them rest, eat, drink, and have their wounds tended at the field headquarters. Before resuming the march, they set out from Lexington at 3:30 p.m. So they've been going on 12 hours now, in a formation that emphasized defense along the sides and rear of the column. Wounded regulars rode on the cannon and were forced to hop off when they were fired at by gathering militia. Where is... Percy's men were often surrounded, but they had tactical advantages of interior lines. Percy could shift his units more easily to where they were needed, while the colonial mission required to move around the outside of his formation. Percy placed Smith's men in the middle of the column, while the 23rd Regiment's companies made up the column's rear guard. Because of information provided by Smith and Pitcairn about how the Americans were attacking, Percy ordered his rear guard to be rotated every mile or so to allow some of his troops to rest briefly. Flanking companies were sent to both sides of the road, and a powerful force of Marines acted as the vanguard to clear the road ahead. So they were going from Lexington to Medford. Maybe from Lexington to Redford. During the respite at Lexington, General William Heath arrived and took command of the militia. Earlier in the day, he had traveled first to Watertown to discuss the tactics with Joseph Warren, who had left Boston that morning, and other members of the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. Heath and Warren reacted to Percy's artillery and flankers by ordering the militia to avoid close formations that would attract cannon fire. Instead, they surrounded Percy's marching square with a moving ring of skirmishers at a distance to inflict maximum casualties at minimum risk. A few mounted militiamen on the road would dismount, fire muskets at the approaching regulars, then remount and gallop ahead to repeat the tactic. The unmounted militia would often fire from long range in hope of hitting some in the main column of the soldiers on the road and surviving, since both British and Colonial used muskets with an effective combat range of about 50 yards. Infantry units would apply pressure to the sides of the British column. When it moved out of range, those units would move around and forward to re-engage the column further down the road. Heath sent out messengers to intercept arriving militia units, directing them to approach places along the roads to engage the regulars. Some towns sent supply wagons to assist in feeding and rearming the militia. Heath and Warren led skirmishers in small actions into battle themselves, but it was the presence of the effective leadership that probably had the greatest impact on the success of these tactics. Clever. The fighting grew more intense as Percy's forces crossed from Lexington into Where's Minitobi? Fresh militia poured gunfire into the British ranks from a distance. Individual hunters began to fight from their own property. Marksmen were also concealed in some homes, forcing the British to clear their path of retreat house by house. A soldier's nightmare. Jason Russell pleaded for his friends to fight alongside him and defend his house, and saying, "An Englishman's home is his castle." He stayed and was killed in his doorway. His friends, depending on which account is to believe, either hid in the cellar or died in the house from bullets and bayonets after shooting at the soldiers who followed them in. Jason Russell's house still stands and contains bullet holes from this fight. A militia unit that attempted to ambush Russell's orders was caught by the flankers, and 11 men were killed, some allegedly after they had surrendered. Citation needed, though, on that one. All right. Percy lost control of his men, and many regulars began to commit atrocities to repay for the supposed scalping at the North Bridge, and for this their own casualties at the hands of a distant, often unseen enemy. Based on the words of Pitcairn and other wounded officers from Smith's command, Percy had learned that the Minutemen were using stone walls, trees, and buildings in these more thickly settled towns closer to Boston to hide behind and shoot at the column. He ordered the flank companies to clear the colonial mission out of such places. Many of the junior officers in the flanking parties had difficulty stopping their exhausted and ranged men from killing everyone they found inside these buildings. For example, 2 innocent drunks who refused to hide in the basement of the tavern in Minitomi were killed only because they were suspected of being involved in the day's events. Although many of the accounts of ransacking and burnings were exaggerated later by the colonists for propaganda value and to get financial compensation from the colonial government, it is certainly true that taverns along the road were ransacked and the liquor stolen by the troops, who in some cases become drunk themselves. One church communion silver was stolen, but was later recovered after it was sold in Boston. Aged Matomi resident Samuel Whittemore killed 3 regulars before he was attacked by a British contingent and left for dead. He recovered from his wounds and later died in 1793 at 98. All told, far more blood was shed in Mintomi and Cambridge than elsewhere that day. So they went from Lexington, they went this way towards Cambridge. The colonists lost 25 men killed and 9 wounded there. The British lost 40 men and 80 wounded, with the 47th Foot and the Marines suffering the highest casualties. Each was about half the day's fatalities. So the British lost, about 100 men and another 200 wounded, which was about a tenth of all the fuckers they had. The British troops crossed the Minnetonka River. What's the Charles River? Where's the Minnetonka River? I don't know. I can't find it. Dude, I'm never using this thing again. The British troops crossed the Matomee River, today known as Owlwife Brook, into Cambridge. All right, so they make it into Cambridge. And the fight grew more intense. Fresh militia arrived in close array instead of scattering formation, and Percy used his 2 artillery pieces and flankers at the crossroad called Watson's Corner to inflict heavy damage on them. Early in the day, Heath had ordered that the Great Bridge be dismantled. Percy's brigade was about to approach the broken-down bridge by the riverbank, filled with militia, when Percy directed his troops down a narrow track, now Beach Street, near present-day Porter Square, and onto the road to Charlestown. The militia, now numbering about 4,000, were unprepared for this movement, and the circle of fire was broken. An American force to occupy Prospect Hill in modern-day Somerville. Okay, so they're coming here. And we have militia forces blocking them off, which dominated the road. But Percy moved his cannon to the front and dispersed them with his last rounds of ammunition. A large militia force arrived from Salem and Marblehead. They might have cut Percy's route to Charlestown, but these men halted on nearby Winter Hill and allowed the British to escape. Some accused the commander of this force, Colonel Timothy Pickering, of permitting the troops to pass because he still hoped to avoid war by preventing a total defeat of the regulars. Pickering later claimed that he had stopped on Heath's orders, but Heath denied this. It was nearly dark when the Pickering's Marines defeated a final attack on Percy's rear when they entered Charlestown. Boom. The regulars took up strong positions on the hills of Charlestown. Some of them had been without sleep for 2 days and had marched 40 miles in 21 hours, 8 of which had been spent under fire. But now they had the high ground protected by heavy guns from the Somerset, which was in Boston Harbor. Gage quickly sent over line companies of 2 fresh regiments to occupy the high grounds in Charleston and build fortifications. Although they were begun, the fortifications were never completed and would later be the starting point for the militia's work built 2 months later, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Generally, he studied the position of the British Army and decided to withdraw his militia to Cambridge. In the morning, Boston was surrounded by a huge militia army numbering over 15,000, so over 5 times as much, which had marched throughout New England. Unlike the powder alarm, which rumors of spilled blood were true, and the Revolutionary War had begun. Now under the leadership of General Artemus Ward, who arrived on the 20th, replacing General William Heath. They formed a siege line extending from Chelsea around the peninsula of Boston and Charlestown to Roxbury, effectively surrounding the Boston on 3 sides. In the days immediately following, the size of the colonial forces grew as militias from New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut arrived on the scene. The Second Continental Congress, the big one, adopted these men into the beginnings of the Continental Army. Even now, after open warfare had started, Gage still refused to impose martial law in Boston. He persuaded the town's selectmen to surrender all private weapons in return for promising that any inhabitant could leave town. The battle was not a major one in terms of tactics or casualties. However, in terms of supporting the British political strategy behind the Intolerable Acts and the military strategy behind the powder alarms, the battle was a significant failure because of the expedition contributed to the fighting it was intended to prevent, and because the few weapons actually seized. Yeah, they really got nothing out of this except for starting the war, I guess. The battle was followed by a war for British political opinion. Within 4 days of the battle, the Massachusetts Provisional Congress had collected scores of sworn testimony from militiamen from British prisoners. When word leaked out a week after the battle that Gage was sending his official description of events to London, the Provincial Congress sent a packet of 3 detailed dispositions. All right, a bunch of commemorations, bicentennial commemorations. All right, we are done with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. We got another thing out of the way. Looks all good. I think I'm going to call that a night. Y'all have a good one.